She found $1 billion of blood money hidden in a spreadsheet nobody else bothered to read. And by morning, the most feared man in Chicago was standing in her office, not to fire her, but to find out who she really was. Stick with this story to the very end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story traveled, and let's begin. The building was quiet the way a held breath is quiet. 11 floors above the loop, the lights in Halstead and Cray Financial Advisory had gone down to half power, the way they always did after 7, and Zariah Coleman sat in the corner office nobody wanted, the one with the busted radiator and the window that didn't quite seal, clicking through a compliance report she'd already read twice. She wasn't supposed to still be here. Marcus from facilities had stuck his head in around 6:30, jingled his keys at her like that was a sentence, and said, "You're going to turn into a desk, Coleman." And she'd said something back she didn't even remember now. And he'd left. And the silence had folded back in around her like water closing over a stone. She liked the silence. She'd learned to. 8 years at this firm had taught her that silence was the only space in the building where nobody was watching her stomach when she ate lunch, or exchanging a look when she reached for a second roll, or joking, always so it could be denied, about how she must really love this job since she never took a lunch hour. Ha ha. Big girls gotta eat, right, Coleman? She had learned to do her best work after the laughter died down for the day. After the office had emptied out and left her alone with the numbers, which never once looked at her and saw a body before they saw a brain. Tonight the numbers were lying to her. That was the only way she could put it to herself, sitting there with her glasses pushed up into her braids and her third cup of bad break room coffee gone cold by her elbow. Something in the Holloway account, a logistics shell out of Cicero, routine as dirt, the kind of account she signed off on 40 times a year without blinking, had a transfer pattern that didn't sit right. Round numbers where round numbers shouldn't be. A wire that left on a Friday and came back, restructured, the following Monday, 3 cents different from what it should have been if you followed the stated interest. 3 cents. Anybody else would have called it a rounding error and gone home. Zariah had spent her whole life being told she didn't belong in rooms like this. Too loud as a kid, too big as a teenager, too intense as a junior analyst, which was what they called a black woman who didn't smile enough at men who outranked her. And the one thing, the only thing, that had never once made her feel like an intruder was a column of numbers that refused to add up. Numbers didn't care what she looked like. Numbers just wanted to be solved. And God help her, she could not let 3 cents go unsolved. So she pulled the underlying ledger, and then the wire confirmations. And then, because something cold and old and animal had started crawling up the back of her neck, she pulled 5 years of Holloway transfers and laid them end to end on 3 monitors like she was performing surgery. By 9:15, her hands had gone still over the keyboard. By 9:40, she'd stopped breathing right. The pattern wasn't in the Holloway account. The Holloway account was just one vein. She traced it sideways, into 2 more shell logistics firms, then into a property management company that didn't own a single property, then into a consulting group whose only listed employee had died 4 years ago, according to the Cook County records she pulled. Not that she should have had access to those, but compliance had given her keys to half this firm's digital basement, and nobody had ever bothered to take them back. $940 million. Conservative count. Moving through Halstead and Cray like blood through a body nobody had bothered to check for a pulse. She sat back. The chair creaked under her, and for one absurd second she thought about how Greg from Risk Management always made that joke when she sat down near him, and she felt something in her chest go hot and ugly and then very, very cold, because none of that mattered anymore. None of that small, stupid daily cruelty mattered, because she was looking at the financial skeleton of something so much bigger than an insult that the insult seemed to belong to a different life entirely. This wasn't fraud. Fraud had a ceiling. This was infrastructure. "Okay," she said out loud to nobody, because the silence had teeth now and she needed to hear a human voice, even her own. Okay, Zariah." She thought about Patricia in compliance, who'd hired her, who used to bring her tea on bad days and call her the only one in this building with sense. She thought about going to Patricia first thing in the morning, laying it all out, doing this the right way, the documented way, the way that wouldn't get her fired for accessing files above her clearance. Then she thought about how 3 people in the firm's senior partnership had personally signed off on Holloway's annual review every single year, and how if this thing went as deep as the numbers said it went, the right way might just mean handing the evidence directly to the people who needed it destroyed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that distantly, the way you notice rain through a window, happening to someone else, somewhere outside the glass. She made a decision in about 4 seconds. The kind of decision that doesn't feel like a decision because your body's already moving before your mind finishes the sentence. She pulled a company-issued flash drive out of her desk drawer, the one IT had given her 2 years ago for a presentation she never ended up giving, and she copied the files. All of it. The ledgers, the wire confirmations, the shell registrations, the dead man's name on the consulting firm's paperwork. Her hands moved fast and clumsy, knocking her cold coffee, catching it before it spilled, swearing under her breath in a voice that didn't sound like the calm, controlled voice she used in meetings. The progress bar crawled. She watched it the way you watch a fuse. 40%. 50. A sound down the hall. Just the building settling, probably. Old buildings did that, groaned like something tired and full of secrets. She told herself that. She did not believe herself. 65%. She thought about her mother, who'd raised 3 kids alone on a CTA driver's salary, and told Zariah from the time she could hold a calculator that her mind was the one thing nobody could ever take from her, the one thing that was hers, and only hers, no matter what anybody said about the rest of her. Zariah had believed that her whole life the way some people believe things they were taught in childhood and never had reason to question, quietly, completely, like gravity. 80%. She thought distantly that if this was what she thought it was, believing in her mind wasn't going to be enough to keep her alive. 94, 98, done. She pulled the drive, and her hand was sweating so bad it nearly slipped out of her fingers, and she shoved it down into the inside pocket of her cardigan. Not her bag. Her bag could be searched. Her bag was the obvious place. And she sat there for a long moment with her heart going like a fist on a door, staring at her own reflection ghosted faint in the dark monitor. She looked tired. She looked scared. She looked for the first time in 8 years at this firm, like someone who mattered enough to be afraid of. She didn't sleep that night. She told herself she would go to the FBI field office on Roosevelt first thing, before work, before anyone could ask her where she'd been. She lay on top of her covers in her studio apartment in Bronzeville with the lamp on and her phone face down on the nightstand because she didn't trust herself not to do something stupid with it, like call someone, like warn someone, like undo the only brave thing she'd done in a decade. Around 4 a.m, she finally understood, lying there in the dark with her heart still not slowed all the way down, that she had stopped being a forensic accountant who found an irregularity. She had become a witness. And in her experience, 8 years of reading other people's secrets in spreadsheets, witnesses had a shelf life. She didn't make it to Roosevelt Street. By 7 a.m., she was back at her desk, because some instinct older and smarter than her told her that disappearing would look exactly like guilt, and showing up looking normal was the only camouflage she had left. She drank her coffee. She answered 3 emails about an unrelated audit. Her hands had nearly stopped shaking by 8:15. At 8:40, the elevator dinged in a way it never dinged. Not the soft, apologetic chime of an early junior analyst slinking in late. This was different, heavier somehow, like even the building knew something had changed. She heard it before she understood why she was hearing it. Silence, spreading down the hallway like spilled ink. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence. A phone call abandoned on hold. Someone's chair rolling back fast enough to bark against the floor. Zariah looked up from her monitor instinctively, the way you look up at a sudden change in weather. 6 men came off the elevator. 5 of them moved like furniture. Big, silent, scanning the room with the flat, professional disinterest of men paid to notice everything and react to nothing. The 6th man walked between them like he didn't need their protection, like he was simply allowing them to exist near him. He was maybe 40. Dark hair going silver at the temples, in a way that looked deliberate, even though she doubted it was. Wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way good suits fit men who'd never once in their life had to think about money. He didn't look around the office the way a stranger looks around an unfamiliar place. He looked around it like a man checking a room he already owned for things that had moved. Patricia, from compliance, went white as paper. Zariah watched her mouth form a name, soundless, terrified. Moretti. And something in Zariah's stomach dropped through the floor and kept falling. She knew that name the way everybody in this city knew that name. Not from news headlines, because men like that didn't make headlines. Not directly. They made the absence of headlines. The cases that quietly closed, the witnesses who quietly recanted, the rival businesses that quietly burned down on slow Tuesday nights. Lucien Moretti ran half of what moved through the city that wasn't supposed to move at all, and he ran it, by every account she'd ever half listened to at office happy hours, with a discipline that made him scarier than the chaos of his predecessors. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't make examples in public. He made problems disappear so cleanly that people forgot the problems had existed. And he was standing in the doorway of Halstead and Cray Financial Advisory at 8:40 in the morning, scanning a room full of accountants like he was looking for something specific. Zariah's hand found the flash drive in her cardigan pocket without her telling it to. Her thumb pressed against the small, hard edge of it, through the fabric, an instinct as old as fear itself. Don't let them see you touch it. Don't let them see you flinch. He started walking, slow, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that was its own kind of threat, because a man in a rush is a man who's afraid of running out of time, and this man clearly believed he had all of it in the world. He passed 3 desks. 4. Greg from Risk Management actually scooted his chair backward, like distance was a kind of safety, like 4 feet of carpet had ever stopped anybody. Zariah didn't move. Couldn't, really. Her body had made a decision her brain hadn't caught up to yet. The same kind of freeze that comes over you when you realize the floor you're standing on is thinner than you thought. She kept her eyes on her monitor, on the unrelated audit, on the email she hadn't finished answering, and she breathed slow and shallow through her nose and told herself, "He's not here for you. There's 900 people on this floor across the building. He's not here for you specifically. Calm down." He stopped at her desk. The office had gone so quiet she could hear the building's ventilation hum, could hear her own pulse working overtime behind her ears, could hear, absurdly, the small electronic tick of her computer fan kicking on. "Zariah Coleman," he said. Not a question. His voice was low, even, accented faintly with something that might have been Chicago Italian 3 generations removed, the kind of voice that had clearly never had to raise itself to be obeyed. Her name in his mouth landed like a stone dropped down a well. She felt it long after the sound stopped. "That's me," she said, and was almost proud of how level it came out, even though her pulse was a jackhammer and her palms had gone damp against her keyboard. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way men usually looked at her, not scanning her body for a joke to make later, not dismissing her in the half-second it took most people to decide she wasn't worth their attention. He looked at her like he was reading something, like she was a ledger he hadn't finished auditing. "You worked the Holloway account," he said. It wasn't a question either, which meant he already knew, which meant somebody had already told him, or something had already flagged, and this was the thought that turned her blood to ice water. Somebody inside this firm had already noticed what she'd pulled overnight, and reported it up a chain she hadn't known existed until this exact second. She had 2 choices, and she understood with total clarity, sitting there with 6 men's worth of silence pressing down on her, that she had about 1 second to make the right one. Lie, and hope he believed her, and buy herself time to get to somebody, anybody, who could protect her. Or tell the truth, because lying to a man who already knew the truth was the fastest way she could think of to convince him she was an enemy instead of an asset. "I worked it," she said. "Last night. Found something that doesn't belong in a logistics shell out of Cicero." Her voice didn't shake. She would think about that detail for months afterward, how, in the worst moment of her life, her voice had simply refused to shake. Like some stubborn, furious part of her had decided that, whatever happened next, she was not going to hand this man her fear along with everything else. Somewhere behind him, one of the big silent men shifted his weight, like he was waiting for a signal. Lucien Moretti studied her for a second longer. Then, very slightly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, nothing so warm as that, but something that acknowledged a thing had landed correctly. 940 million, he said. Give or take. The number, her number, the one she'd calculated alone at 9:40 the night before in an empty office with her hands shaking, came out of his mouth like he already had it memorized. Like he'd been waiting for her to say it back to him and confirm what he already suspected. The office around them had stopped pretending not to listen. Patricia had her hand pressed flat against her own collarbone. Somewhere, a phone was ringing, unanswered, 3 desks over. "You found it in 12 hours," he said. "My own people have been looking for 6 months." It took her a second to understand what he meant, and then it landed, all at once, cold and absolute. He wasn't hunting the woman who'd uncovered his organization's stolen money. He was hunting whoever had stolen it, and he had just discovered, standing 3 feet from her desk, with the entire 11th floor of Halstead and Cray holding its collective breath, that the only person in this building smart enough to find the truth, the only person who'd actually solved in one overnight session what an army of professionals had failed to crack in half a year, was a plus-size black forensic accountant the rest of this firm had spent 8 years pretending not to see. "Get your things," he said. Not a request. Zariah's stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" "You're coming with me." He said it the way other men said good morning. Flat, certain, no room built into the sentence for refusal. Either as a witness who already knows too much to be safe in this building by lunchtime, or as the person I need to finish what you started last night. Your choice which one you'd rather be. She looked past him, at Patricia's white face, at the security men whose stillness had stopped feeling like calm and started feeling like a held trigger, at the whole watching, frightened, silent room of people who had spent 8 years deciding she was invisible and were now witnessing in real time the exact opposite of that conclusion. She thought about the drive in her cardigan pocket, about the dead man's name on the consulting firm paperwork, about the 3 senior partners who'd signed off on Halloway every year, about 4 in the morning and the certainty, cold and absolute, that she had become a witness with a shelf life. She thought, "There's no version of this morning where I walk away clean." "Give me 5 minutes," she heard herself say. Lucien Moretti nodded once, like that was exactly the answer he'd expected. Not gratitude, not fear, just a woman doing the math and arriving, the way she always did, at the only number that made sense. What Zariah didn't know yet, couldn't know yet, sitting frozen at her desk with her pulse hammering, and the whole office staring and a Mafia Boss waiting on her decision like it was the most ordinary request in the world, was that the moment she stood up from that chair, she would never sit down at this desk, in this life, as this version of herself, ever again. She didn't know that by nightfall, 2 of the men she'd shared a break room with for years would be dead, their throats slit not for what they knew, but for what they were about to tell someone who could have stopped this. She didn't know that the order to silence them, to silence her, had already gone out an hour before Lucien Moretti's elevator ever opened on the 11th floor. Sent quietly by someone who didn't yet know the accountant had a 6-foot bodyguard problem named Lucien Moretti standing directly between her and the men coming to finish the job. She only knew, standing up slowly from her desk with her legs unsteady beneath her and 6 dangerous men watching her every movement, that the silence she'd loved, the silence that had let her work in peace for 8 quiet years, the silence where nobody watched her eat lunch or made jokes about her size, that silence was over now, completely and forever, and there was no version of the rest of her life that would ever be quiet again. She reached for her bag. Her hand, for just a second, brushed the flash drive through her cardigan one more time, like checking that a wound was still closed. It wasn't, not really. It had only just started bleeding. And somewhere 11 floors below, in a black car idling at the curb with its windows tinted dark enough to hide a man checking a silenced pistol in his lap, professional killer Victor Kane received a single text message, 3 words, no signature, and smiled the particular smile of a man who'd just been told his morning had gotten interesting. The text read, "She knows. Move now." The car smelled like leather and gun oil, a combination Zariah would never again be able to separate in her mind from the particular flavor of terror that comes from sitting very still next to a man you don't trust while the city slides past the window like nothing's wrong. Lucien sat across from her in the back of the Escalade, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped, giving orders in a tone that didn't rise or fall no matter what he was saying. She caught fragments. "Lock down the Cicero property. Pull everyone off the Halloway file until I say otherwise. Find out who flagged her overnight." That last one made her stomach turn over. "Somebody flagged me," she said, when he finally lowered the phone. Not a question. She'd had 20 minutes now to do the math she should have done at 4 in the morning, and the math wasn't good. "That's how you knew. Somebody in that office saw what I pulled last night and called you before I even got my coffee this morning." Lucien didn't answer right away. He was looking out the window, jaw tight, a muscle working under his cheek like he was chewing on something he didn't want to say. Somebody flagged you, he agreed finally. Not to me. Then who? That's the question, isn't it? She felt her hands curl into fists in her lap. 8 years of being underestimated had taught her exactly one useful thing: how to recognize when a man was managing her instead of answering her. Don't do that, she said. Don't talk to me like I'm one of your guys in the front seat. I just spent the worst 12 hours of my life finding out my employer's been laundering money for criminals, and now I'm in a car with one of the criminals, and you're going to tell me what's actually happening, or you can let me out right here. The silent man in the front passenger seat, young, maybe 30, jaw like a brick, turned his head slightly like he wanted to see how his boss handled that. Lucien held up 2 fingers, barely, and the man turned back around. There's a leak, Lucien said. Inside my organization, has been for almost 2 years. Every shipment that's gone bad, every deal that's fallen through right when it shouldn't have, every soldier I've lost on a corner that should have been clean, all of it traces back to information somebody on the inside's been feeding out. I've had 4 people working that problem for 6 months and gotten nothing but dead ends and dead men. And you think the Holloway account is connected? I know it is. I just didn't know how until this morning, when somebody in your firm's compliance department made a call they had no business making to a number they had no business having the second you copied those files. He looked at her directly then, and for the first time she saw something underneath the careful stillness. Not warmth, nothing as simple as that, but a kind of focused, hungry attention, the look of a man who'd been handed a piece he didn't know he was missing. You found in one night what I couldn't find in 6 months. I need to know what else you can find. I'm an accountant, she said, not whatever it is you think I am. You're the smartest person who's walked through that building in a decade, and everybody in it spent 8 years too busy laughing at you to notice. He said it flat, no compliment in his voice, just an observation, the way he might have described a fact about a building's load-bearing walls. I don't have time to be wrong about people, Miss Coleman. I'm not wrong about you. She wanted to hate how much that landed. She hated it anyway. The estate sat on the north shore, past Winnetka, behind a stretch of trees thick enough that you couldn't see the lake until you were standing on the back terrace, and it just opened up in front of you, gray and enormous and indifferent. It didn't look like a criminal's house. It looked like old money pretending it had never been anything else. Stone and ivy, and a security detail so well-trained it took Zariah a full hour to even notice the cameras tucked into the gutters. They put her in what they called the East Wing, which turned out to be a converted study with 3 monitors already set up, a secure terminal, and a woman waiting for her. Mid-50s, silver bob, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, introduced simply as Renata. Lucien's head of financial security, Renata said, shaking Zariah's hand with a grip that suggested she'd broken bones with it before. For the next however long this takes, you work with me. I run analysis. You're going to tell me I've been doing it wrong. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He doesn't bring people here unless they're about to make somebody's life difficult. Renata's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Question is whose? Zariah set down the bag they'd let her grab from her apartment, toothbrush, a change of clothes, the only book she owned that she actually reread, and looked around the room like she was trying to memorize the exits, which she was. I want to call my mother, she said. No. Excuse me? You heard me? Renata didn't even look up from her screen. Anybody you call gets a target on them the second this thing goes loud, and it's going loud, Miss Coleman, sooner than you think. You want your mother safe, you let her go on not knowing where you are for a while. Zariah's jaw clenched so hard it ached. That's not your call to make. It's exactly my call to make. It's literally my job. Renata finally turned, and there was something almost gentle underneath the bluntness, the kind of gentleness that comes from a person who's had to deliver this particular speech to a lot of frightened people over a lot of years. I know this feels like a kidnapping. I promise you, it's the opposite. The version of this where Lucien doesn't get to you first is the version where you're already dead, and so is everybody who loves you, because once that compliance call went out, your name's already in front of people who don't ask twice. Zariah sat down slowly in the chair across from the terminal, her legs suddenly unwilling to hold her up. Okay, she said quiet. Okay, show me what you've got. What Renata had was a mess. 18 months of half-finished trails, dead-end shells, 3 different analysts' handwriting layered over each other in margin notes that contradicted themselves. The visible wreckage of an investigation that had been thorough and competent and had still failed again and again to close the loop. Zariah understood why within the first hour. They'd been looking for the leak as a person, a name, a face, a soldier with a grudge or a debt or a price. She didn't care about the person yet. She cared about the money, because the money never lied about what it loved, even when the people moving it lied about everything else. By 6 that evening, she'd built a flowchart across 2 monitors that made Renata go quiet in a way she clearly wasn't used to going. 3 accounts, Zariah said, dragging a line between 2 nodes with her finger, not even looking up. These 2 move in lockstep with Holloway disbursements. Same day, same percentage spread, every single time going back 14 months. And this third one, the consulting shell with your dead employee on the paperwork, it doesn't move with Holloway at all. It moves 2 days before anything happens on your side, before raids, before lost shipments. Before, Renata repeated. Before, which means whoever's funneling this money isn't reacting to your organization's operations. They're predicting them. Somebody's feeding them your schedule before it happens, and the consulting account is paying them for it. Zariah finally looked up. That's not a leak in your supply chain. That's a leak in your planning. Somebody close enough to know what you're going to do before you do it. The room went very still. How close? Renata said, and her voice had changed entirely, gone tight and careful in a way that told Zariah she already had a name forming in her head she didn't want to say out loud. Inner circle close, Zariah said. I'd guess single digits of people who'd have that kind of access. Renata didn't answer that. She stood up, walked to the window, and stood there with her back to the room for a long moment, arms crossed. And when she finally turned around, her face had the particular gray look of someone doing arithmetic they already knew the answer to and hated. I need to talk to Lucien, she said. Don't touch anything else until I'm back. Zariah didn't listen, obviously. The second the door clicked shut, she was back in the data, because that's who she was. That's who she'd always been. She didn't know how to leave a half-finished problem sitting on a table, even when the problem had teeth. She found the pattern in the timestamps about 40 minutes later. The consulting account didn't just move 2 days before operations. It moved 2 days before operations that had been discussed, specifically at something called the Tuesday sit-down, a recurring meeting referenced obliquely in 3 different documents, never explained, clearly some kind of standing leadership meeting. Whoever was leaking wasn't just inner circle. They were in that room every week. She was still staring at it, trying to find a name attached to the meeting, when the door slammed open hard enough to bounce off the wall. It wasn't Lucy Shen. It wasn't Renata either. It was a man in his 30s, dark-haired, sharper-featured than Lucien, but with the same eyes, wearing a leather jacket that looked deliberately out of place in a house this formal, like he wore it specifically because it annoyed someone. He crossed the room in 4 fast strides and put both hands flat on the desk in front of her, leaning down into her space hard enough that she pushed her chair back on instinct. You're the accountant, he said. Not a question. His voice had an edge that hadn't been sanded down the way Lucien's had, younger, angrier, closer to the surface. And you are? Dominic. He said it like the name should mean something to her. When her face stayed blank, something flickered across his annoyance, maybe, or relief. She couldn't tell which. Lucien's brother. You've been here 6 hours and you're already telling my brother's people who to suspect of selling us out. That's a fast resume for somebody who got dragged out of an accounting firm this morning. Zariah's pulse kicked up, but she kept her face flat, the way she'd learned to keep it flat through 8 years of meetings where men twice her seniority tried to bait a reaction out of her so they could dismiss whatever came after it. I didn't name anybody, I found a pattern. Renata's the one who went pale, not me. You found a pattern that points at the inner circle. Dominic straightened up, dragging a hand back through his hair, and she watched him pace 2 steps toward the window and back, agitation rolling off him in waves. You understand what that means, right? You're sitting in my brother's house 6 hours after he met you, telling people there's a traitor in his closest circle, based on spreadsheets, based on math. You don't know these people. You don't know what 2 years of war does to a family, and you're about to blow it apart based on a column of numbers. The numbers don't care about your family, Zariah said, quiet, level. That's kind of the point of numbers. Something dangerous moved across his face, there and gone. Careful, he said, low. The door opened again. Lucien this time, Renata a step behind him, and the temperature of the room dropped about 10 degrees the moment he took in the scene. His brother leaning over the desk, Zariah pushed back in her chair, the air thick enough to choke on. Dominic. Just the name, flat, but it carried weight enough that Dominic straightened up immediately, putting space between himself and Zariah like he'd been caught at something. I was asking her about the analysis, Dominic said. Same thing you're about to ask her. I just got here first. You got here yelling at a woman I brought into this house for protection. Lucien crossed the room slowly, and Zariah noticed, filed it away, the way she filed away every small detail now, because details were the only weapon she had left, that he positioned himself slightly between her and his brother without seeming to do it on purpose. That's not how we do things here. How we do things here got us a leak nobody's caught in 2 years, Dominic snapped. Maybe it's time we did things different. The brothers stared at each other for a long beat, and Zariah understood, watching it, that she was seeing the surface of something much older and much deeper than tonight. Years of it, maybe decades. The particular friction of two men who loved each other and resented each other in exactly equal measure. The older one carrying weight the younger one had never been trusted to carry. The younger one hungry for it in a way that had curdled somewhere along the line into something closer to grievance. Renata, Lucien said without taking his eyes off his brother. What did she find? Renata cleared her throat, glancing at Zariah like she was asking permission, which Zariah hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. Zariah gave the smallest nod. The consulting account doesn't react to our operations, Renata said. It predicts them. Specifically, it moves 2 days ahead of anything discussed at the Tuesday sit-down. The room went silent in a different way now. Not tense, but stricken, like all the air had been let out of it at once. Dominic's face had gone pale under the leather jacket's tough guy posturing. That's 8 people, he said quietly. 8 people in that room. 7, Lucien said. 8 if you count me, and I think we can rule out the possibility that I'm selling myself out. Nobody laughed. It wasn't that kind of joke. Who else? Dominic said. Renata started listing names. Zariah watched Lucien's face as each one landed, a flicker here, a tightening there, the particular stillness of a man cataloging 2 decades of relationships and finding, in real time, that he could no longer fully trust any of them. When Renata got to the 6th name, Dominic's, Zariah watched something shift in Lucien's expression that he tried, almost successfully, to smooth over before his brother noticed. Dominic noticed anyway. Don't, Dominic said, voice gone low and dangerous in a different way now, hurt underneath the anger. Don't look at me like that, not you. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. I've known you my whole life, Lucien. I know what your face does when you're doing math on whether your own brother sold you out. Dominic's hands had curled into fists at his sides. 28 years. I have been at your side for 28 years. I buried our father next to you. I took a bullet meant for you in 19 that you've apparently forgotten, and the second some woman you met this morning hands you a spreadsheet, you're standing there wondering if it's me. I'm not wondering anything, Lucien said, but his voice had gone careful in a way that gave the lie to it, and they both knew it. You are. I can see it. Dominic's jaw worked, and for a second Zariah thought he might actually cry, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd thrown a punch. 8 years I've been second to you in this family. 8 years of watching you make every call, take every meeting, get every ounce of respect while I run the corners and clean up whatever mess is too small for you to bother with personally. And now there's a leak, and instead of trusting me to help you find it, you're standing here wondering if I'm the one who's been selling us out to the people who killed half our crew. I never said, you didn't have to say it. Dominic's voice cracked up into something raw, echoing off the stone walls. That's the whole problem, Lucien. You never have to say anything, because everybody in this family has spent their whole life reading your face for the verdict, and right now your face is reading guilty. The silence after that was the worst one yet. Zariah sat very still in her chair, acutely aware that she had walked into a war that had been simmering for decades and had just, without meaning to, lit the fuse. Lucien's voice, when it finally came, was quiet. Quieter than anything he'd said all day, which somehow made it worse. I trust you, he said. I have trusted you since we were kids sharing a bedroom in a house that didn't have heat half the winter. I'm not accusing you of anything." He paused, and something passed over his face that looked almost like grief. "But I have to look at everyone. That's the job. If I don't look at everyone, including you, including myself, then I'm not protecting this family. I'm just hoping, and hope doesn't keep people alive. Numbers do." He glanced, just for a second, at Zariah when he said it, and she understood that he was quoting something back at his brother that she'd essentially taught him in the last 6 hours. Dominic followed the look. His face did something complicated. Anger and humiliation, and something that might have been jealousy, fast and ugly, and gone almost before it surfaced. "Right," he said, voice flat now, all the rawness sanded back down under something colder. "Right. The accountant's got you talking like a spreadsheet already." He looked at Zariah directly for the first time since the explosion, and his eyes had gone hard. "Hope you're as good as he thinks you are, Miss Coleman. Because the last time my brother trusted somebody this fast, it didn't end well for them." He walked out without waiting for a response, the door swinging shut hard enough to rattle the window glass. The room sat in the wreckage of it for a long moment. Renata cleared her throat, picked up a folder she didn't need, and quietly excused herself, leaving Zariah alone with Lucien for the first time since the car. "I'm sorry," Lucien said finally. "You shouldn't have had to see that." "I think I needed to see that," Zariah said, surprising herself with how steady it came out. "I needed to see what happens to people in this house when the numbers point somewhere uncomfortable. Because eventually, Mr. Moretti, the numbers are going to point somewhere uncomfortable again. And I need to know you're not going to do to me what your brother thinks you just did to him." Something in his face shifted. Not softening, exactly, but a kind of recognition, like she'd said something he respected, even though he didn't enjoy hearing it. "I won't lie to you," he said. "I can't promise you this house stays calm. I can promise you I'll never punish you for what the numbers say. That's the one thing I have never done in 19 years of running this family. I don't shoot the messenger." A pause, dry, almost bitter. "I find out who made the message true, and I deal with them instead." Zariah held his gaze for a long moment, trying to decide if she believed him, and finding, somewhat to her own discomfort, that she mostly did. "Okay," she said, "then let's find out who's lying to you. Because somebody in that sit-down has been lying to you for 2 years, and your brother just told the whole house exactly how raw that nerve is. If the league's smart, and they're smart, Mr. Moretti, 2 years undetected isn't luck. They just watched the same argument we did. They know you're closing in. People who know they're about to get caught do one of 2 things. They run, or they make sure you're dead before you can prove it." It was past midnight when the first body was found. Not at the estate, at a bar on the south side that Halstead and Cray's junior staff frequented after hours, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox nobody had updated since the Bush administration. 2 of Zariah's former co-workers, low-level analysts named Devin and Priya, who'd never said more than 10 words to her in 8 years beyond the occasional barbed joke about her lunch, were found in the alley behind it, throats opened with a precision that the responding officers would later describe, off the record, as professional. Zariah found out about it because Renata came into the East Wing at 12:40 with her phone in her hand and her face the color of ash. "You knew them," Renata said. It wasn't really a question. "Devin Walsh and Priya Patel, they worked 2 desks over from me." Zariah's hands had gone very still on the keyboard. "They weren't even close to this. They didn't know anything. They wouldn't have known a money laundering scheme if it sat down next to them at lunch and introduced itself." "Doesn't matter what they knew," Renata said quietly. "Matters what somebody thought they might have heard. You were the only one working late. Word's already gotten back to whoever's running the other side that the discovery came out of your office. They're not taking chances on loose ends. They're just removing everyone who was in the building." Zariah felt something crack open inside her chest, hot and sick and furious all at once. "They're dead because of me. They're dead because somebody decided 2 innocent people were an acceptable cost for covering their own tracks. That's not the same as being dead because of you." Renata's voice had gone hard, almost angry, like she needed Zariah to understand this immediately and completely. "Don't you dare let them turn this into your guilt. That's exactly what they want. A scared, guilty accountant who second-guesses herself right when we need her sharpest." Zariah pressed both hands flat against her eyes, breathing slow, fighting down the urge to be sick. When she finally lowered them, her face had gone hard in a way it hadn't been before tonight. Something had closed over in her, some last soft place sealed up tight. "Then I need everything," she said. "Every file, every account, every name in that sit-down room. If they're killing people to bury this, the only way to stop the killing is to finish the math faster than they can run." Renata studied her for a long moment, then nodded, slow. "There's one more thing," Renata said, and something in her tone made Zariah's stomach drop before the words even came. "The hit on the bar. The order went out at 7 this morning." Zariah blinked. "That's before Lucien even got to my office." "Right." Renata's jaw tightened, which means whoever ordered it already knew what you found before Lucien did. Before you copied a single file off that drive, somebody already had eyes inside Halstead and Cray reporting back. Somebody knew the second you started pulling those wire confirmations last night in real time, while you were still sitting alone in that office thinking nobody could see you. The cold that went through Zariah then had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Somebody was watching me," she said slowly, "before any of this, before I even knew what I'd found." "Somebody's been watching that account for a long time," Renata said, "which means the leak isn't just inside Lucian's family. It's inside your old firm too, both sides of this, which means—" The door burst open before she could finish. Dominic again, but different this time. Not angry, urgent, his face pale and tight, a tablet clutched in one hand like a weapon. "We've got a problem," he said. And for once, there was no edge in his voice at all, just plain, flat fear, which scared Zariah more than anything he'd said earlier. "Eddie just called in from the south gate. There's movement on the perimeter cameras. Multiple vehicles, no plates, parked a half-mile out on the access road for the last 20 minutes, not moving." "Could be nothing," Renata said, but her hand had already gone to the radio clipped at her hip. "It's not nothing." Dominic turned the tablet around, and Zariah found herself looking at grainy night vision footage of 4 black SUVs sitting motionless in the dark, engines idling, exhaust ghosting white in the cold air. "Lucian wants everybody in the main house. Now." They moved fast through the hallway, Renata in front, Dominic behind, Zariah caught between them with her heart slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt. They found Lucien in the security office, 3 monitors glowing in front of him, his face lit pale and sharp in the screen light, and the look on his face when he turned to them was one Zariah hadn't seen on him yet. Not the cold control from the car, not the careful diplomacy from the argument with his brother. This was something raw, something that looked almost like fear, quickly mastered and put away. "They found us already," Lucien said, "faster than I expected. Either somebody talked or—" He stopped himself. "Or what?" Zariah said. He looked at her then, and the weight of the look told her the answer before he said it. "Or somebody in this house called them themselves," he said. "Tonight, after the argument." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the room understanding exactly what he meant, exactly who'd been standing in this house an hour ago, humiliated and furious and storming out before anyone could stop him. Dominic's face went white. "You can't be serious." "I'm not accusing you," Lucien said, low, fast, like he was trying to get the words out before his own doubt could stop him. "I need you to hear that I am not accusing you. But I need everyone in this room to understand that in about 4 minutes, armed men are going to be on this property, and I do not currently know which of the people standing in front of me I can trust with my life. That is the situation. That is where 2 years of a quiet leak has brought us." On the monitor behind him, one of the 4 SUVs began rolling slowly forward, headlights dark, toward the gate. Zariah felt the flash drive against her ribs through her cardigan, the same place she'd pressed it that morning a lifetime ago in a quiet office on the 11th floor of a building she would probably never see again. She thought about Devin and Priya bleeding out in an alley for a crime they didn't even know existed. She thought about her mother, somewhere across the city, sleeping in an apartment with no idea her daughter was standing in a glass-walled security room, watching the end of the world roll slowly up a private driveway. "Lock it down," Lucien said, voice gone hard and final, all the warmth burned out of it. "Everyone, now. There's no more time to figure out who we trust. We find out tonight, the hard way, or we don't find out at all because we're dead by sunrise." The first gunshot came less than 90 seconds later, distant and flat and absolutely real. And Zariah Coleman understood, standing frozen in a stranger's house with blood already spilled in her name, that whatever life she'd had before yesterday was gone for good, and there was no road left that led back to it. The second gunshot came closer than the first, and Lucian moved before the echo finished, grabbing Zariah by the arm and hauling her down behind the security console hard enough that her knee cracked against the floor and she bit back a cry. "Stay low," he said, voice gone flat and mechanical, all the careful diplomacy stripped out of it. He was already keying his radio. "Southgate, report. Southgate, report. Now." Static. Then a voice, ragged, breathless. "Two men down at the gate. They came through the tree line. We didn't even—" The transmission cut hard, swallowed by a burst of gunfire that didn't sound like it belonged on a radio. It sounded like it belonged in the room with them. And Zariah flinched so violently she knocked her elbow into the desk leg. Dominic was already moving toward the gun cabinet against the far wall, hands shaking as he keyed the combination wrong twice before getting it right. "I told you," he said, not looking at anyone, voice tight as wire. "I told you something didn't feel right tonight, and everybody's standing around staring at her." A jerk of his chin toward Zariah. "Like she's the only thing that matters, while the whole house goes dark." "Nobody's staring at her instead of the gate, Dominic. Pull a weapon and get to the East Hall," Lucien snapped, and there was a crack in his voice now, something Zariah hadn't heard from him yet. The sound of a man whose careful control was costing him more than he was letting anyone see. Renata had her own sidearm out already, crouched by the doorway, eyes flicking between the monitors and the hall. "4 vehicles," she said. "If they came in clean through the tree line at the south gate, that's not opportunists. That's somebody who had the gate schedule. Somebody who knew exactly where the blind spot in the camera coverage sits because I redesigned that coverage myself 8 months ago, and exactly 6 people in this house have ever seen the layout." The number hung in the room like smoke. 6 people. Zariah did the math without wanting to. The same 6 the Tuesday sit-down conversation had circled around 2 hours earlier. The same 6 whose names Renata had read off one by one, while Dominic's face went through every color of betrayal. "We don't have time for this," Lucian said, hauling Zariah up by the arm, keeping her low, moving her toward the interior hallway that led down toward what he'd called the command room earlier, a windowless space buried under the east wing that Zariah had assumed was paranoia when Renata first mentioned it. It didn't feel like paranoia now. It felt like the only thing standing between her and a bullet. "Where's your brother?" Zariah said, breathless, as Lucien shoved her through a reinforced door, and another security man, older, gray at the temples, a man named Sal she'd been introduced to in passing hours ago, slammed it shut behind them and threw 3 separate bolts. "Covering the East Hall." Lucien's jaw was tight enough to crack a tooth. "He'll hold it. He's held worse." "You don't sound sure." "I'm not sure of anything right now," Lucien said, and for the first time since she'd met him that morning, his voice broke just slightly at the edges, raw and human in a way that scared her more than the gunfire had. "That's the entire point of tonight. I am not sure of anything, Miss Coleman, and people are dying because of it." The command room was small, low-ceilinged, lined with monitors that fed from every camera on the property. Zariah found herself staring at grainy, green-tinted footage of men in tactical gear moving through the tree line in practice 2-and-2 formations. And something in her chest, some part of her brain that had spent 8 years reducing chaos into spreadsheets, started doing the only thing it knew how to do under pressure. It started counting. 8, she said. "I count 8 men moving on the south approach. That's not a robbery crew. That's a small army." "Victor Kane doesn't send robbery crews," Renata said grimly, having followed them in, slamming the door behind her and throwing the last bolt herself. "He sends exactly enough men to guarantee the job. Never more, never less. He's efficient. It's the only thing about him that's not monstrous." "Who's Victor Kane?" Lucien and Renata exchanged a look that told her everything she needed to know before either of them spoke. "The man the rival organization keeps on retainer for exactly this," Lucien said. "Cleanup. Witness removal. He doesn't miss, and he doesn't stop until the job's finished, which means he's not here for territory tonight. He's here for you, specifically, and for me, because you and I are now the only 2 people who can connect the consulting shell to the people paying for it." On the monitor, the 8 men split into pairs, fanning out toward different points of the house, and Zariah watched with a cold, sick fascination as one pair paused directly beneath the camera. She now understood Renata had mentioned only 6 people knew existed, and adjusted course around it without hesitation, like men who'd been handed a map drawn by someone who lived here. They know the blind spots, Zariah said quietly. Renata, they're not improvising. They have your layout. Renata's face had gone the color of old paper. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. A burst of gunfire crackled close enough now that Zariah felt it in her teeth, and a voice screamed something over the radio that cut off mid-word, and Lucien's hand closed around the radio so hard his knuckles went white. "That's Sal," he said, very quietly. "That's Sal's channel." Nobody answered the radio call he made next. Nobody answered the second one either. It was Renata who found it, 20 minutes later, and the chaos of trying to triangulate which doors had been breached and which were holding, her hands flying across a secondary terminal, while outside the walls the gunfire rose and fell in waves like weather. She'd pulled up the access logs for the South Gate's camera blind spot, the one only 6 people had ever seen, cross-referencing badge swipes for the night Renata had originally walked the property with the security contractor 8 months ago. Her hands stopped moving. "No," she said, so quietly Zariah almost didn't hear it over the gunfire. "No, that's not... Run it again." "Renata," Lucien's voice had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man bracing for something he already half knew was coming. "What did you find?" She turned the monitor toward him, and Zariah watched his face from 3 feet away as he read whatever was on that screen, watched the color drain out of it in real time, watched something in his jaw lock up so hard it looked like it might shatter, watched 19 years of certainty collapse behind his eyes in the space of about 4 seconds. "That's wrong," he said. "That has to be wrong." "It's not wrong, Lucien. I built the system. I know what I'm looking at." Renata's voice had gone hollow, stripped of everything but disbelief. The badge that swiped into the blind spot review meeting 8 months ago. The one access log that explains how somebody outside this house knew exactly where the gap in our camera coverage sits. It's not one of the 6 names we were looking at tonight. "Then whose is it?" Zariah said, even though some animal part of her brain already knew, had already done the math 3 seconds ahead of the sentence, the way it always did. Renata didn't answer with words. She turned the monitor fully toward the room, and the name on the screen sat there in flat, ordinary text, the most ordinary thing in the world. The kind of small administrative detail that destroyed entire lives without ever raising its voice. DiMoretti, access granted 1432. The room went so quiet, Zariah could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears, could hear the distant pop of gunfire outside like it was happening on another planet, could hear Lucien's breath catch and hold and not release. "That's impossible," Lucien said, but his voice had no conviction left in it at all. Just a man saying words because silence was somehow worse. "Dominic was 30 feet from me when that meeting happened. He doesn't even know how to read a security schematic. He's never cared about that side of the business. He didn't need to read it," Renata said, gentle now, the gentleness of someone delivering a diagnosis they wished they could take back. "He needed to photograph it, or describe it to somebody who could. Lucien, I'm not telling you what it means. I'm telling you what the log says. The rest is yours to do with." Lucien sat down very slowly in the chair beside the terminal, like his legs had simply stopped being willing to hold him. And Zariah watched a man who'd spent the entire day projecting absolute control come apart at the seams in total silence. No shouting, no tears, just a kind of catastrophic internal collapse happening behind a face that didn't know how to show it anymore. 28 years, he said, almost to himself. He told me 28 years. He told me he took a bullet for me in 19. His hands had curled into fists on his knees, shaking, almost imperceptibly. I made him underboss. I gave him the South Corridor operations because he asked for it, because I thought giving him something of his own would stop him resenting standing in my shadow. I thought I was fixing something. Lucien. Renata's voice had an edge of warning in it now, the recognition of a man approaching a cliff. "We don't have time for this right now. There are 8 armed men in the house, and he sold us out for 2 years. Lucien's voice rose, cracked, dropped back down hard, oscillating between fury and grief in a way that made him sound almost unrecognizable. "Every man we lost, every shipment. Marco, Renata. He had 3 kids. He died in an ambush on the Pulaski corridor 11 months ago because somebody told the other side exactly where and when, and the whole time it was... He couldn't finish the sentence. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, hard, like he was trying to physically push the realization back inside his skull, where it couldn't hurt him anymore. A new burst of radio static cracked through the room, and a voice, young, panicked, one of the security men Zariah hadn't been introduced to, came through ragged and fast. "Boss, we got a breach on the East Hall. They're inside. Repeat. They are inside the house. Dominic's team isn't responding. I don't know where..." The transmission cut to gunfire and then nothing at all. Lucien's head came up. Something had changed in his face. The grief still there, raw and visible, but pushed down under something colder now. Something that looked, for the first time since Zariah had met him that morning, genuinely dangerous. "Where is he?" Lucien said, voice gone flat and terrible. "Where is my brother right now?" Renata checked a third monitor, fingers flying. "East Hall, near the gun cabinet. Camera shows him alone. No hostiles visible near his position." "Alone," Lucien repeated. "In the one part of the house that just went dark on comms. Convenient." "Lucien, don't what, Renata? Don't think it? I've been not thinking it for 2 years. I've been standing in rooms with that boy, breaking bread with him, trusting him with men's lives, not thinking it, because he's my brother, and the alternative was unthinkable. And now half my crew is dead in the yard, and the access log says his badge unlocked the door that let it happen." His voice had gone hoarse. "I'm done not thinking it." He stood, and for the first time Zariah saw him reach for a weapon himself, pulling a pistol from a locked drawer beneath the terminal with hands that had finally stopped shaking, gone instead into the terrible steadiness of a man who'd made a decision he couldn't take back. "You can't go out there alone," Renata said, moving to block the door. "Not like this. Not with Kane's men still active in the house. I'm not asking permission. I'm not giving you a choice." Renata's voice cracked like a whip, and for a moment the two of them stood inches apart, the air between them thick enough to choke on, two people who'd clearly known each other for decades having the same fight they'd probably had a dozen times before, except this time the stakes weren't an argument. They were a body count. You go out there half out of your mind with grief and rage, you get yourself killed, and then this family has no leader and no plan, just a war and a corpse where its boss used to stand. Is that the legacy you want? Is that what keeps everyone left alive tomorrow? Lucien's jaw worked. For a moment, Zariah thought he was going to push past her anyway. It was Zariah who spoke next, surprising even herself, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her hands were shaking so hard she'd had to grip the edge of the desk to hide it. "There's something you're not accounting for," she said. Both of them turned to look at her like they'd forgotten she was in the room. And maybe, for a second, they had. "The badge log proves Dominic had access," Zariah said, forcing her voice to stay level, forcing herself to think like an accountant, and not like a woman who just watched a man's entire world get pulled out from under him. "It doesn't prove he used it for this. I've spent 8 years reading evidence that looked airtight, and finding out it wasn't. One data point isn't a conviction, it's a question." She swallowed hard. "And right now you have 8 armed men inside this house, and a brother alone in a dark hallway with no comms, and you're about to decide he's guilty and go kill him based on a single access log, while the actual threat is still shooting your people in the East Wing. Even if you're right about him, especially if you're right about him, going out there alone right now doesn't get you justice. It gets you dead, and it gets him away clean because nobody left standing in this house will know what you knew." The room went silent except for the distant, irregular percussion of gunfire, closer now than it had been 5 minutes ago. Lucien stared at her for a long moment, breathing hard, the pistol still gripped in his hand, something in his face warring violently with itself. "She's right," Renata said quietly. "You know she's right." "I know nothing right now," Lucien said, but he didn't move toward the door. His shoulders had dropped, just slightly, the fight in his body redirecting into something colder and more controlled, the rage banking itself down instead of burning out in the open. "Fine. We don't go in blind, we go in smart. But the second this is over, Renata, the second the threat outside is neutralized, I am looking my brother in the eyes and I am asking him myself. And God help him if he can't answer me." He caught himself on the word, glanced at Zariah like he expected some reaction, but she said nothing. There were worse things to worry about tonight than an old phrase out of habit. What happened over the next 11 minutes would later be reconstructed by Renata in a debrief. Zariah wasn't present for, pieced together from camera footage and radio logs, and the testimony of the 4 security men who survived it. But Zariah lived through her own version of it in real time, crouched behind the reinforced door of the command room with Renata beside her and Lucien gone. Because in the end he had gone, slipping out a side passage the moment Renata's attention split for 30 seconds, leaving Zariah with a curt, "Stay here. Bolt the door behind me. You're the only thing in this house Kane's people actually need alive. Don't make their job easy." Before the door sealed shut and Zariah was alone with Renata and the sound of a war happening one wall away. She tried not to think about the fact that she had become, in less than 24 hours, a strategic asset valuable enough to be locked in a panic room while men killed each other over her existence. She tried not to think about Devin and Priya in that alley, about the 3 cents that had started all of this, about her mother sleeping somewhere across the city with no idea any of this was happening. She failed mostly, but she also did the only useful thing she knew how to do with terror. She kept working, pulling up everything Renata had on Dominic's financial footprint over the last 2 years on a side monitor, hands shaking, breath ragged, because if there was a truth buried in those numbers, she needed to find it before Lucien found his brother, before either one of them did something that couldn't be undone. It took her 6 minutes to find what she was looking for, and when she found it, her stomach dropped through the floor. "Renata," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Renata, look at this." Renata leaned over her shoulder, and Zariah watched her face change in the half-light of the monitor. It wasn't what either of them expected. The financial trail didn't lead to Dominic spending money he shouldn't have, didn't show some hidden account swollen with betrayal money. It showed the opposite. Dominic's accounts, thin, strained, drained almost to nothing over the last 14 months. Money moving out in patterns that looked less like profit and more like payments. Desperate payments. The kind a man made when somebody had something on him. "He's not getting paid," Zariah said slowly, piecing it together even as she said it out loud. "He's paying. Somebody's been bleeding him dry for over a year. This isn't a man who sold his family out for money. This looks like a man being blackmailed into it." Renata's face had gone very still. Blackmailed with what? Before Zariah could answer, the radio on the desk crackled to life, and this time it was Lucien's voice, breathless, raw, cutting through the static with words that stopped Zariah's heart cold in her chest. Renata, I found him." A pause. Gunfire, distant, somewhere behind his voice. "He's not the only one here," Lucien said, and his voice had gone strange, hollow, like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't fully process. "Renata, there's a second shooter in this hallway, and it's not one of Kane's men. It's wearing our colors. It's one of ours." Zariah's hand froze over the keyboard. "Lucien," Renata said into the radio, urgent now. "Lucien who? Tell me who." The answer that came back wasn't his voice at all. It was someone else's, calm and amused and utterly unfamiliar, cutting in over Lucien's channel, like he'd been listening the whole time and had simply been waiting for his moment. "Hello, Miss Coleman," the new voice said, smooth and cold, addressing her directly even though she hadn't keyed a single transmission all night, which meant, and the realization hit her like a physical blow, that he'd been listening to this channel far longer than tonight. "Victor Kane, I believe we have some unfinished business, and I'm afraid your friend Lucien just found out the very expensive way that the leak in his family was never just his brother." A pause, deliberate, cruel. "It was 2 of them," Kane said, "and the second one's standing about 4 feet from him right now, with a gun raised, and Mr. Moretti hasn't decided yet whether he's fast enough to do anything about it." The radio went dead. Zariah stared at the silent speaker, every cell in her body gone cold and electric at once. The floor of the world she thought she understood dropping away beneath her for the second time in 24 hours. And somewhere on the other side of that reinforced door, in a dark hallway lit only by muzzle flash, Lucien Moretti stood facing a betrayal so much wider and deeper than the one he'd braced himself for that there was no version of the next 60 seconds that wouldn't change everything. Renata was already moving, already keying every channel at once, shouting Lucien's name into a radio that gave back nothing but static, and Zariah sat frozen at the terminal with her hands hovering over the keyboard. Useless now, every column of data in the world meaningless against the sound of silence where a man's voice should have been. She thought, with a clarity that felt almost like falling, whatever I do next, there's no math that gets us out of this clean. And then, from the hallway beyond the reinforced door, impossibly close, she heard the unmistakable sound of a single gunshot, followed, a heartbeat later, by a second. The silence after the second gunshot lasted exactly as long as it took Zariah's heart to slam twice against her ribs, and then Renata was moving, ripping the bolts back on the reinforced door with hands that didn't shake, even though her face had gone the color of bone. "Stay here," Renata said. "No." Zariah was already on her feet, the flash drive pressing hard against her ribs through her cardigan like it was trying to remind her it existed. "You said it yourself. I'm the only thing in this house Kane's people need alive. That makes me the safest person to walk down that hallway right now, not the most dangerous. You go out there alone and you're just another body he doesn't need to keep breathing." Renata stared at her for half a second, weighing it, and something in her face conceded the logic even as every instinct in her clearly screamed against it. "Behind me. Exactly behind me. You so much as breathe wrong, I'm putting you back behind that door myself." The hallway beyond the command room had gone dark, except for the strobing red glow of an emergency light somewhere down at the far end, and the air smelled like cordite and copper, a smell Zariah would carry in the back of her throat for the rest of her life. Smoke hung low along the ceiling. Somewhere distant, gunfire still cracked in short, controlled bursts. Not chaos anymore, she registered dimly, but something more organized, like the random violence of the initial breach had resolved itself into actual combat. Men with training instead of just men with guns. They found Lucien 30 feet down the corridor, on one knee beside a body, and for one long suspended moment, Zariah's whole chest seized because she couldn't tell from the angle whose body it was. Then Lucien turned his head, and she saw his face, gray and stricken but alive, and the relief that went through her was so violent it nearly buckled her knees. The body on the floor was a man she didn't recognize, older, heavy-set, wearing the same dark tactical gear as Lucien's security men, a Halstead & Cray employee badge clipped incongruously to his vest like he'd grabbed it on his way out the door that morning for reasons that suddenly made horrible sense. Blood pooled black under the emergency lighting, spreading out from a chest wound that had stopped him mid-stride. "Tomas," Lucien said, voice hoarse, not looking up. "Head of internal security. 12 years with this family. 12 years. His hand was pressed flat against the dead man's chest, like he could somehow push the truth back inside the body and undo it. "He's the one. The badge logs, the camera blind spots, all of it. Dominic's badge got cloned, copied off him somehow 18 months ago, and Tomas has been running the actual leak this whole time, using my brother's own access to cover his tracks because nobody would ever think to look at the man who built our security system in the first place." Zariah felt something cold and sick crawl up her spine. "Where's Dominic?" Lucien's face did something complicated, grief and shame fighting for space. "He went after Tomas the second I told him what the logs showed. He figured it out faster than I did. Said something about Tomas asking strange questions 2 months back, about how I'd react if I ever found a leak this deep, and it didn't sit right with him at the time, and he buried it because he didn't want to believe somebody he trusted that much could be capable of this." He swallowed hard. "He saved my life 30 seconds ago. Tomas had a clean shot on me from the stairwell. Dominic put himself between us and took the second shot meant for my chest. The floor seemed to tilt under Zariah's feet. He's hit? Shoulder. Through and through, I think. Renata's people have him in the kitchen pantry. It's the closest thing to defensible cover we've got left on this floor." Lucien finally looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, raw, 28 years of buried doubt and guilt, all surfacing at once in a hallway that smelled like death. "I almost killed my own brother tonight. I had the gun in my hand and I was ready to believe a single line on a screen over 28 years of him bleeding for this family, and the only reason I didn't pull the trigger first and ask questions after is because you made me wait. You made me think instead of feel." His voice cracked. "I owe you his life. I don't know how a man pays a debt like that." There wasn't time to answer. The radio at Renata's hip crackled, and this time the voice that came through wasn't static-laced panic from one of the security men. It was smooth, patient, almost bored. "Mr. Moretti?" Victor Kane said. I do hope that little family reunion was touching. I genuinely mean that. I'm not being clever. It's rare to watch real love in a profession built on betrayal. But sentiment doesn't change my schedule. And I'm afraid my schedule says you and the accountant are due downstairs in roughly 4 minutes, or I start putting holes in the very capable people still trying to defend this house room by room. Your call. I'm a patient man, but I bill by the hour, and your people are costing my employer a great deal of money tonight. Lucien's jaw locked. He keyed the radio with hands that had gone perfectly steady, the grief from 30 seconds ago folding itself away somewhere deep, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Touch one more of my people, Kane, and I will spend whatever's left of my life and every dollar I have making sure your name means nothing to nobody. You'll die in an alley and no one will bother to bury you. A soft laugh crackled back through the static. Threats are for men who still think they're winning. 4 minutes, Mr. Moretti. The clock's already running. The radio went dead. They found Dominic in the kitchen pantry exactly where Lucien said he'd be, propped against a shelf of canned goods with the security man Zariah didn't know pressing a balled-up dish towel hard against his shoulder, already soaked through dark red. His face had gone waxy pale, sweat beading along his hairline, but his eyes were open, sharp, furious with pain and adrenaline in equal measure. You came, he said, looking at Lucien, voice tight. Even after you were ready to put a bullet in me an hour ago. I wasn't ready, Lucien said, crouching beside him, hand closing hard around his brother's good shoulder. I was scared. There's a difference, and I should have trusted you enough to know it. I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Dom. Yeah, well, Dominic hissed through his teeth as the security man adjusted the pressure on the wound. Apologize after we're not all about to die. Kind of poor timing, brother. It was almost a joke. Almost. The kind of brittle, exhausted humor that men reached for when the alternative was screaming. And Zariah found herself oddly moved by it, even with her pulse hammering, and 4 minutes draining away somewhere in the back of her skull like sand through a fist. How many men does Kane have left active? Renata said, all business, already pulling up a tactical map on a tablet one of the security team had shoved into her hands. 3 confirmed down on our side, the security man holding the towel reported, voice tight. Eddie at the south gate, Sal in the east hall, and Marcus by the wine cellar stairs. 2 of theirs down too, maybe 3, hard to say in the dark. That leaves Kane himself, plus what, 4, 5 of his original 8? 5, Lucien said grimly. And he's not going to stop sending them in waves until either we're dead or he's got what he came for. Zariah's mind was already working, the cold analytical part of her brain that had carried her through 8 years of finding patterns nobody else could see, sliding into gear even through the haze of terror, because terror, she was discovering, didn't actually stop a brain built the way hers was built. It just gave it sharper edges to work with. He doesn't want me dead, she said slowly. He said it himself. He wants me downstairs. That means somebody on the other side still believes I have something worth taking alive. Which means they don't actually know I already copied everything onto a second drive and that Renata's team has had it mirrored on a secure server since this afternoon. She looked at Renata. Do they know that? No reason they would, Renata said. We kept that quiet, even from most of our own people. Then Kane's whole approach tonight is built on a false assumption. He thinks the evidence dies if I die, or if he gets the drive off my body. He's wrong. The evidence already exists in 3 places that aren't me. Zariah's heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her voice came out steady, almost eerily calm, the way it always did when a problem finally clicked into shape in front of her. Which means I'm not actually the asset he thinks I am anymore. I'm bait. And if I'm bait, I might as well be bait on my own terms instead of his. Lucien's head came up sharp. Absolutely not. You don't get a vote on this one, Mr. Moretti. It came out harder than she intended. 8 years of being talked over in conference rooms by men who assumed they understood her capacity better than she did, finally boiling up and over. I have spent my entire adult life being told what I'm capable of by people who never once asked me. I am not doing that again tonight, not with my own life on the table. I have an idea, and it's the only one anybody in this hallway has come up with in the last 90 seconds. So either help me make it work, or get out of my way. The hallway went very quiet. Dominic, even through his pain, let out a short, surprised laugh. I like her, he said to his brother. God help you, but I like her. Lucien stared at Zariah for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Fear, yes, but underneath it, something that looked almost like awe, like he was watching, in real time, the exact thing he'd recognized in her that morning in a quiet office on the 11th floor finally show its full shape. Tell me the idea, he said. Fast. It took 90 seconds to lay out, the words coming faster than her breath could quite keep pace with. But the bones of it were simple, the kind of simple that only looked simple after a forensic accountant had spent a lifetime learning that the cleanest solutions were always financial, never physical. She didn't have a gun. She'd never fired one in her life and wasn't about to start tonight in a smoke-filled hallway with men bleeding on the floor around her. But she had something Victor Kane and whoever was paying him had badly, catastrophically underestimated. She had the complete architecture of the rival organization's financial backbone sitting on a server that Renata's people could access from a laptop in under 2 minutes. And she had, sitting in her exhausted, terrified electric mind, 3 months of patterns compressed into a single afternoon of work. And she knew, with the absolute clarity of someone who'd spent a career finding the one number that broke an entire scheme, exactly where that backbone was thinnest. They're not winning this war with manpower, she said, crouched now beside Renata's laptop in the relative shelter of the pantry, fingers already flying across the keyboard even as gunfire continued to crack somewhere above and around them. They never were. Lucien's organization has more soldiers, more territory, more years of built infrastructure. The only reason the rival side has been winning anything the last 2 years is the leak, knowing where to strike, when to strike, what to avoid. That's it. That's the entire advantage. Take away the information, and they're just a smaller, weaker operation that's been bluffing its way through a war it can't actually win on the merits. So we kill the leak, Dominic said, wincing as he tried to shift against the shelving. Tomas is dead. Doesn't that already do it? Thomas being dead stops the information flowing forward from tonight on. It doesn't undo 2 years of stolen advantage, and it definitely doesn't stop the men currently inside this house from finishing what they came here to do. Zariah's hands didn't stop moving. But here's what it does do. Every dollar that organization has used to fund this war, every payment to men like Victor Kane, every bribe, every weapons buy, every single piece of it runs through the financial network I've already mapped. The Holloway account, the Shell Logistics firms, the Dead Man's Consulting Group. It's not just evidence of what they did. It's the actual plumbing of how they pay for what they're doing right now, tonight, in this house. She pulled up the flow chart she'd built that afternoon, the one that had made Renata go quiet hours ago, and for the first time laid it out not as evidence of a crime, but as a weapon. I can freeze it, she said. Not all of it. Some of these accounts are too deep, too layered. It'd take federal subpoenas and months of process to touch directly. But the consulting shell, the 2 lockstep accounts, and at least 4 of the offshore numbered accounts I traced this afternoon, those are vulnerable right now, tonight, because they're using third-party correspondent banks that have anti-money laundering compliance triggers built in by law. If I report the right transaction patterns to the right automated flagging systems simultaneously, across multiple jurisdictions, in the next 20 minutes, those accounts lock. Not eventually, immediately. It's how the system's designed to work. It doesn't wait for a judge if the pattern matches known laundering signatures closely enough. It freezes first and asks questions for months afterward. Renata had gone very still, staring at her. You can do that from here? Tonight? With men shooting at us? I can do the analysis from here. I need actual internet access to a financial intelligence reporting portal, which means I need a connection that isn't being jammed, which I'm assuming is part of why your team's comms have been so unreliable the last 20 minutes. Zariah looked up, meeting Renata's eyes. Somebody's running a jammer on this property. Probably one of Kane's men, probably close, because the radio dead zones have been getting worse, not better, as the night's gone on. If we can find that jammer and kill it, even for 5 minutes, I can light up every flag in that network at once. Lucien was quiet for a moment, processing, and then something shifted in his face. The grief and fury from earlier folding into something colder, more purposeful. A general recalculating a battlefield. If their funding freezes mid-operation, he said slowly, Kane doesn't get paid for tonight. Mercenaries like him don't fight for loyalty. They fight for the invoice. And the men backing this whole war lose the ability to pay for weapons, for soldiers, for the bribes that have kept this whole thing running under the radar for 2 years, Zariah said. You don't have to beat them with bullets, Mr. Moretti. I can beat them with a wire transfer reversal. That's the whole point of finding me in that office this morning, isn't it? You said it yourself. I find in 12 hours what your best people couldn't find in 6 months. So let me finish what I started. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Somewhere above them, a fresh burst of gunfire rattled through the floor joists, closer now, and a man's voice screamed something that cut off hard. Eddie's team is falling back to the second floor, the security man with the dish towel reported grimly, listening to a radio earpiece, voice tight with barely controlled panic. They're not going to hold the stairwell more than a few more minutes. Lucian's jaw set. He looked at Zariah, then at his brother, bleeding and pale against the shelving, then at Renata, then back at Zariah. And Zariah watched him make the calculation in real time. Watched a man who'd spent 19 years solving every problem with force and discipline, finally, completely, hand the entire fate of his organization over to a woman he'd met 14 hours ago because she was simply the smartest person in the building. Do it, he said. Renata, get her a connection. Dominic, you're with me. We're finding that jammer before Eddie's people lose that stairwell. Sal, he caught himself, jaw tightening at the name of a man he didn't yet know was dead or alive. Whoever's left standing on comms, converge on the second floor. We buy her time. However long it takes, we buy it. 20 minutes, Zariah said. Maybe less if I get lucky with the flagging systems. Maybe more if the connection's unstable. I can't promise you a clock, Mr. Moretti. I can only promise you I'll work as fast as the math allows. Then we'll buy you 20 minutes, Lucien said. And for the first time since the gunfire started, something almost like a smile crossed his face. Exhausted, grim, but real. I've bought worse odds for worse reasons. The next several minutes fractured into the kind of overlapping chaos that Zariah would only ever be able to describe later in pieces, disconnected and raw, because she spent almost all of it crouched over Renata's laptop in the relative dark of the pantry with her heart in her throat and her hands shaking so badly she had to consciously, physically steady them between each command, breathing in counts of 4 the way her mother had taught her decades ago for a different kind of fear entirely. Renata had gone with Lucian and Dominic to hunt the signal jammer, leaving Zariah with one remaining security man, young, barely older than a kid, introduced in passing as Theo, gripping a shotgun with white-knuckled hands and watching the pantry door like it might come apart at any second. You ever done this before? Theo asked, voice cracking slightly, somewhere in the second-long minute of silence between bursts of distant gunfire. Freeze accounts. Like in real life, not just in movies? I've reported suspicious activity before, Zariah said, not looking up, fingers moving across the keyboard in the half-light of the screen. Never 12 accounts simultaneously across 4 jurisdictions while people shoot at me through a wall. So, no, Theo. Tonight's a first for both of us. He let out a short, strangled laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. Good to know I'm not the only one improvising. The connection dropped twice in the first 8 minutes. The jamming clearly still active somewhere on the property, and each time it dropped, Zariah felt something close to panic claw up her throat before she forced it back down, forced her hand steady, restarted the process from the last save checkpoint with the grim, mechanical determination of someone who had learned over 8 long years that panic never once solved a spreadsheet, and it wasn't going to start solving one now. On the 9th minute, the radio Theo carried crackled to sudden, sharp life. Found it! Renata's voice came through, breathless, urgent. Wine cellar, behind a rack, professional rig. Lucien's got it. Give it 10 seconds. A pause. Then, abruptly, the static hiss on every channel cleared, replaced by clean, open air, and on Zariah's screen the connection indicator flipped from red to a steady, beautiful green. Go, Renata's voice said. Go, go, you're clear. Do it now. Zariah didn't waste the moment on relief. She moved fast, hands flying, pulling up the financial intelligence reporting portals she'd identified that afternoon. 3 separate systems, 2 domestic, 1 routed through an international anti-money laundering consortium that Halstead and Cray itself was technically a registered reporting member of, a detail that made her almost laugh out loud at the dark irony of it. The very firm that had laundered the money providing her the credentials to help destroy it. She input the Holloway transaction patterns first, flagging the round number anomalies and the 3-cent discrepancy that had started everything less than 24 hours ago, a lifetime ago, a different version of her own life ago. Then the 2 lockstep accounts, their synchronized movements laid bare in a report that practically wrote itself. The pattern so clean and so damning that she half expected the automated system to flag it as too obvious to be real. Then the consulting shell, the dead man's name still listed as the sole employee 4 years after his death, a detail she suspected would end up in some federal prosecutor's opening statement someday. Her hands trembled over the keyboard as she reached the offshore numbered accounts, the deepest layer, the ones she'd traced only that afternoon and verified twice because the implications had scared her the first time she'd seen them. These were the accounts that mattered most, the ones actively funding tonight's operation, the war chest paying for Victor Kane's services, and the 5 men currently trying to kill everyone she'd come to depend on in the span of a single impossible day. A fresh burst of gunfire cracked somewhere close enough that the pantry door rattled in its frame, and Theo spun toward it, shotgun raised, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Stay on it," he said to her, voice tight, eyes locked on the door. "Whatever's happening out there, you stay on that screen. That's the job, right? That's what the boss said. You're the one weapon they didn't see coming." Zariah's fingers didn't stop moving even as her whole body screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything other than sit exposed in a pantry with a teenager and a shotgun standing between her and whatever was on the other side of that door. She entered the final account number, cross-referenced the transaction signature against the known laundering pattern thresholds, and hit submit on the last report with a hand that had finally, mercifully, stopped shaking. The portal returned to confirmation, clean and bureaucratic and utterly unglamorous. A small green checkmark on a government website that represented, in its own quiet way, the most violent thing she'd ever done to another human being in her life. Report submitted. Automated review in progress. Estimated processing time, 4 to 12 minutes. "It's submitted," she said, voice hoarse. "All 12 accounts. Now we wait." The pantry door exploded inward. Theo fired first, the shotgun blast deafening in the enclosed space, and Zariah threw herself sideways off the stool hard enough to crack her shoulder against the shelving, cans clattering down around her in a chaotic percussion that she'd remember for the rest of her life as the sound of nearly dying. Through the ringing in her ears and the smoke and the chaos, she saw a man go down in the doorway. And then a second man step over him, weapon already raised, moving with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who did this for a living and had never once in his career felt the need to rush. Victor Kane stepped into the pantry's wreckage, stepping over the body of the man Theo had just killed without so much as glancing down at him, his eyes finding Zariah immediately, unerringly, like he'd known exactly where she'd be the entire time. "Miss Coleman?" he said, and his voice was exactly as smooth and patient as it had sounded over the radio, somehow more terrifying in person for how utterly calm it was, how absolutely untroubled by the gun smoke and the blood and the boy with the shotgun bringing his weapon back up toward him with shaking, desperate hands. "I did warn your friends about the timeline." Theo fired again. Kane moved. Not fast, exactly, but with a precision that made speed irrelevant, a single economical step that put him at an angle where the shot tore through empty shelving instead of his chest. And before Theo could rack another shell into the chamber, Kane's own weapon spoke once, flat and final, and Theo went down against the pantry wall and didn't get back up. Zariah's scream lodged somewhere in her throat and never made it out. She was on the floor, back pressed against the lowest shelf, cans and boxes scattered around her, and Victor Kane crossed the small space in 3 unhurried strides and crouched down in front of her, weapon held loose and casual in one hand, like a man settling in for a conversation rather than concluding an execution. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, conversational, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd screamed at her. "You're going to hand me whatever drive you've got left on you, and you're going to come with me, quietly, and Mr. Moretti's surviving people upstairs are going to live through the next hour because I have absolutely no further interest in killing anyone once I have what I came for. Or you scream, you fight, you make this difficult, and I put a bullet in your kneecap and drag you out of here anyway, except slower and messier. And a lot more people die in the meantime because your friends will hear it and come running, and I'll have to kill them too. I'd genuinely rather not. It's extra paperwork." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with something that looked almost like professional curiosity. Your choice, Miss Coleman. You strike me as someone who appreciates having a choice. Zariah's whole body was shaking, her shoulder throbbing where she'd cracked it against the shelf. The ringing in her ears from the gunshots not yet faded, and somewhere in the back of her mind a small, cold, calculating part of her brain was doing the only math it knew how to do under pressure, counting seconds, counting probability, counting the 4 to 12 minutes a government portal had promised her was somewhere in progress right now. An invisible clock ticking down toward a detonation Victor Kane didn't even know was already armed. She needed to stall him. She needed exactly that. Minutes, just minutes, and she had absolutely no weapon to do it with except the only one she'd ever truly had. "You're not going to get paid," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, steady enough that something flickered across Kane's composed face for just a fraction of a second. Surprise, maybe, or the first faint shadow of doubt. "Whoever's funding this operation, whatever account they're planning to wire your fee from when this is finished, check your phone, Mr. Kane. Check it right now. I think you're going to find it's already too late to negotiate anything." For one long second, Victor Kane didn't move at all, and that stillness was somehow louder than any threat he'd made since stepping through the pantry door. Then, slowly, deliberately, like a man who refused to let anyone see him rattled, even when he was, he reached into his jacket with 2 fingers and drew out a phone, thumb swiping the screen without lowering the gun an inch. Zariah watched his face in the gray emergency light, watched the practiced calm hold for exactly as long as it took him to read whatever notification was waiting there, and then watched it crack. Not shatter. Victor Kane didn't seem like a man built to shatter, but crack. A hairline fracture spreading fast across something that had been smooth and untroubled a moment before. 3 accounts, he said, very quietly, almost to himself. Frozen in the last 6 minutes. He looked up at her, and the curiosity in his eyes had sharpened into something colder, more assessing. "You did that. From a pantry, while I was walking through the front door." 12 accounts, actually, Zariah said. Her voice was shaking, but she pushed through it because she understood with the same cold clarity that had carried her through the Holloway ledgers 2 nights ago that the only currency she had left to bargain with was information, and information was the one thing she'd never once in her life failed to wield well. The consulting shell with the dead man's name on it. The 2 accounts that move in lockstep with every operation your employer runs. 4 offshore numbered accounts I traced this afternoon that I'm guessing are exactly the ones your invoice was supposed to clear through. She made herself hold his gaze even though every instinct in her body wanted to look away from the gun, from the blood already drying dark on the floor where Theo had fallen. "You're not getting paid tonight, Mr. Kane. Maybe not ever. And men like you, from what I understand, don't keep doing dangerous things for people who can't pay the invoice." Something shifted behind his eyes, fast, calculating, a professional recalculating risk in real time the way she'd recalculated a financial pattern an hour ago. For a moment she thought she'd miscalculated badly, thought the cold logic of her words might simply make her more valuable to kill quickly and disappear before anyone could ask harder questions. Then, instead, he did something she hadn't expected at all. He laughed. Short, humorless, but genuine. "You're either the bravest person I've ever pointed a gun at," he said, "or the dumbest. I haven't decided which yet." He straightened slightly, weapon still raised, but his weight shifting back onto his heels. A fractional change in posture that Zariah, who had spent a lifetime reading the smallest tells in numbers that didn't want to be read, recognized instantly as the posture of a man doing math of his own. "Here's my problem, Miss Coleman. I don't work for free, and I definitely don't die for free. If what you're telling me is true, my employer just became a significantly worse business partner than he was an hour ago, possibly the kind of partner who ends up in a federal indictment with my name somewhere in his phone records." He tilted his head. "So convince me. Convince me finishing this job is still worth the very real chance I walk out of this house into a financial graveyard with nobody left alive to write me a check." It was, Zariah understood in that frozen, terrified second, the strangest negotiation of her entire life. Pleading for her life not with mercy, not with fear, but with the one language a mercenary actually spoke. "Walk away," she said. "Right now. Nobody in this house even needs to know you left. I'll tell Lucien Moretti you disappeared in the chaos, that you ran when the funding collapsed, and he'll believe it, because that's exactly what a smart man in your position would do. You keep your life. You keep whatever reputation you've built that doesn't depend on tonight's outcome. The alternative is you put a bullet in me, in this pantry, for an employer who can't pay you anymore, and within 48 hours, every federal agency watching that frozen money is going to be asking who was on the payroll the night this all happened. You become a name in a file instead of a ghost nobody can prove existed. That's a worse trade than walking away with nothing. The gunfire above them had thinned, she registered distantly. The chaotic overlapping bursts of 10 minutes ago settling into something sparser, more deliberate. The sound of a battle reaching its natural exhaustion rather than its climax. Victor Kane studied her for a long, silent moment, weapons still raised. But his finger, she noticed, with something that wasn't quite hope, but was close to it, no longer resting against the trigger guard the way it had been 30 seconds ago. You know, he said finally, in another life, you'd have made a hell of a negotiator. He lowered the weapon, slow, deliberate, and something in Zariah's chest released so suddenly it nearly buckled her. For the record, Miss Coleman, this isn't mercy. I don't have any despair. This is just good business. I find it advisable to be on the winning side of an invoice, and you've just convinced me, very persuasively, that I'm currently standing on the wrong one. He turned without another word and was gone through the shattered doorway, vanishing into the smoke and the dying gunfire as silently and efficiently as he'd arrived. And Zariah sat alone on the pantry floor between two bodies, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, staring at the space where a professional killer had been standing 30 seconds before and trying to understand that she was, somehow, impossibly, still breathing. She found Theo's pulse first, frantic fingers against his throat, and felt something in her chest crack wide open with relief when she found it. Faint, thready, but there, the shotgun blast having caught him high in the shoulder rather than the chest, the same kind of wound Dominic was nursing somewhere else in this house. She tore strips from a kitchen towel hanging off a hook by the pantry door and pressed them hard against the wound the way she'd seen Renata's man do for Dominic, her hands working on pure instinct and adrenaline, some part of her brain noting distantly that she'd never in her life had to do anything like this. And her body seemed to know how, anyway, the way bodies sometimes did when the alternative was watching someone die. "Stay with me," she said, voice cracking. "Theo, stay with me, okay? You did good. You did so good. You hear me?" His eyes fluttered, found hers, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across his pale lips before he went under again. The gunfire outside had nearly stopped entirely now, reduced to sporadic, isolated cracks, and a few minutes later, though it felt like an hour, felt like a year, felt like the longest stretch of time Zariah had ever lived through, Renata burst through the ruined doorway with two security men behind her, weapon raised, scanning the wreckage with the particular speed of someone bracing for the worst. "Zariah!" Renata's voice broke on the name, something Zariah hadn't expected from a woman who'd seemed forged entirely out of competence and controlled fury. "God, you're alive, I thought." She dropped to her knees beside Theo, checking the wound Zariah had packed, nodding fast, professional instincts overriding emotion. "This is good work. This is going to hold him till the medics get here. Where's Kane?" "Gone," Zariah said. "He left. I told him the money was frozen, told him there was nothing left in this job worth dying for. And he just—" Her voice cracked, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain out of her all at once, leaving something shaking and hollow in its place. "He left, Renata. I talked a hired killer out of murdering me with a spreadsheet." Renata stared at her for a long moment, something between disbelief and awe moving across her exhausted face. And then, unexpectedly, she laughed. A short, broken, genuine laugh. The kind that comes out sideways when a body has simply run out of any other way to release what it's been holding. "Of course you did," she said. "Of course that's exactly what you did." It took another 40 minutes for the house to go fully quiet, for the last of Kane's remaining men to either flee or fall, for Lucien's surviving people to sweep every room and confirm what Zariah already suspected, that the moment the funding froze, the operation upstairs had collapsed almost as fast as it had begun, men who'd been fighting with purpose 20 minutes earlier suddenly fighting like men who understood, somewhere in the animal part of their brains, that the war they'd been promised payment for no longer existed. Zariah found Lucien on the back terrace as the sky outside finally began to lighten, gray bleeding slowly into something less than black above the lake. The whole estate behind them a wreckage of broken glass and bullet-pocked stone, and the quiet, terrible aftermath of a night nobody in this house would ever fully recover from. He was sitting on the stone steps, elbows on his knees, staring out at the water like it owed him an answer it wasn't going to give. She sat down beside him without asking, because somewhere in the last 24 hours the question of whether she was allowed to do things like that had simply stopped applying to her. 3 of my people died tonight, Lucien said, not looking at her, voice scraped raw and flat with exhaustion. Sal, Eddie, a kid named Marcus who'd been with me 11 months, wanted to save up enough to put his sister through nursing school. He shook his head slowly. I keep doing the math. 3 of mine dead, 2 of theirs, Tomas dead by my brother's hand, and somewhere out there Victor Kane's walking free because you talked him out of finishing the job. I don't know how to add that up into something that feels like a win. It's not a win, Zariah said quietly. I don't think there's a version of tonight that was ever going to be a win. I think the only thing on the table was which losses you could live with. She looked out at the lake with him, gray and vast and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened on this shore. Devin and Priya are dead because somebody decided 2 accountants who'd done nothing wrong were an acceptable cost for covering a 2-year lie. Theo's in a hospital bed right now because he stood between me and a bullet without hesitating for half a second. Your brother's got a hole through his shoulder because he finally believed, after 28 years, that you might actually need him to prove himself instead of just resent the shadow he stood in. None of that is a win, Mr. Moretti. It's just what survival cost this time. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned to look at her, something in his exhausted face had shifted, softened, in a way she hadn't seen from him yet, not even in the moments of grief in that smoke-filled hallway. Lucien, he said, after everything we've been through tonight, I think you've earned the right to drop the Mr. Moretti. Despite everything, despite the blood in the bodies and the bone-deep exhaustion settling into every muscle she had, Zariah found something close to a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Lucien, then. The federal response, when it came, arrived with the particular speed and overwhelming force that 12 simultaneously frozen accounts spanning 4 jurisdictions tended to provoke. By 8 that morning, less than 24 hours after Zariah had first noticed 3 cents out of place in a routine compliance report, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had opened a formal investigation into Halstead and Cray Financial Advisory, working in tandem with 3 international banking regulators whose automated systems had flagged the exact pattern Zariah had fed them in a pantry while a hired killer stood over her with a raised weapon. She gave her statement twice, once to a tired, sympathetic agent named Ruiz, who took careful notes and asked her, more than once, if she was sure she was okay to keep talking, and once to a federal prosecutor whose interest sharpened visibly the moment Zariah began walking through the financial architecture she'd mapped, the round numbers and lockstep transfers, and the dead man's name on consulting paperwork, until the prosecutor finally set down her pen and said, with something like genuine respect, I've had forensic teams spend 18 months on cases with less clarity than what you built in a night. She didn't mention everything. There were things, the precise location of Lucien's estate, certain names that belonged to a world she'd been pulled into rather than chosen, the specifics of what exactly happened to Victor Kane after he walked out of that pantry, that she folded carefully away and kept for herself, not out of loyalty exactly, not yet, but out of a more complicated instinct she didn't have a clean name for. Survival, maybe, or the simple recognition that some debts didn't get repaid by handing every piece of someone else's life over to a federal file. The story that made the news 3 days later was simpler than the truth, the way these stories always were. A massive money laundering scheme uncovered at a prestigious Chicago financial firm. Dozens of arrests, including 3 senior partners who'd spent years signing off on Holloway's annual reviews without ever once asking the question Zariah had asked in 12 hours on an ordinary Tuesday night. International accounts frozen, an organized crime financial network dismantled, a heroic young forensic accountant credited, anonymously, at her own insistence, because she had absolutely no interest in becoming a target for whatever remained of the organization Kane had once worked for, with blowing the entire scheme open. Patricia called her the day the news broke, voice trembling. "I had no idea," she kept saying over and over. "I had no idea what was sitting under that account, Zariah. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea—" "I know," Zariah said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "I know you didn't." She didn't go back to Halstead and Cray. There was, in the most literal sense, no Halstead and Cray left to go back to Borge. The firm dissolved within a month under the weight of its own exposure, its assets seized, its name scrubbed from the directory of the building where Zariah had spent 8 quiet, underestimated years building a skill nobody had bothered to notice until the night it mattered more than anything else in her life. She visited Theo in the hospital on the 4th day, found him sitting up in bed looking pale but stubbornly cheerful. His shoulder wrapped thick in white bandages, a bag of chips balanced on his lap that he was clearly not supposed to be eating given the IV line running into his other arm. "Hey," he said, brightening when she walked in. "The lady who talks killers out of killing people. Heard you walked Kane right out the door with nothing but math. Heard you took a shotgun blast trying to protect a stranger you'd known for 6 hours," she said, sitting carefully in the chair beside his bed. "I think you win that comparison, Theo." He shrugged, wincing immediately at the movement. "Boss said it was my job. Guess I take instructions seriously." A pause, and something more serious moved across his young face. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you talked him down instead of trying to be a hero. I've seen guys try to be heroes. Usually just means somebody else has to clean up the mess after." She thought about that for a long time after she left the hospital, driving back toward the city in a car Lucian had insisted she keep for as long as she needed it. The gray skyline rising up ahead of her, familiar and strange all at once, like a city she'd lived in her whole life and a city she was seeing clearly for the very first time. She wasn't a hero. She didn't think she'd ever wanted to be one. Not really. She'd just been a woman who couldn't leave a column of numbers unsolved, even when solving it cost her everything she thought her life was supposed to look like. That was the whole truth of it, stripped down to its simplest form, the way she stripped every complicated problem down until it told her what it actually was, instead of what it pretended to be. She found Dominic 2 weeks later, recovering well enough to be sitting outside on the estate's rebuilt terrace, already rebuilt, already scrubbed of bullet holes and broken glass. Money being one of the few things that healed fast in this particular world, nursing a coffee with his bad arm still in a sling. "You came to gloat," he said, not unkindly, when she sat down across from him. "I came to ask you something." She studied him for a moment, the sharp features so like his brother's, the leather jacket replaced now with something softer, less armored. "The blackmail. The reason your accounts were bleeding dry for 14 months before any of this happened. You never told your brother what it was, did you?" Something flickered across his face. Surprised that she'd found it, and beneath that something rawer. "Gambling debt," he said finally, quiet, ashamed in a way that the angry, defensive man from that first chaotic night would never have admitted to. 3 years ago. Bad one. Tomas found out somehow. He found out everything, apparently, the whole time, hiding in plain sight. And he held it over me. Said if I didn't quietly cover certain things for him, certain questions I wasn't supposed to ask about certain shipments, he'd make sure Lucian found out his own brother had nearly bankrupted himself behind his back, made himself an embarrassment, a liability. He looked out at the lake, jaw tight. I told myself I was protecting the family by keeping it quiet. Really, I was just protecting my own pride. And it almost got my brother killed. And it definitely got better men than me killed, because I was too proud to admit I'd made a mistake and ask for help. "You told him eventually," Zariah said. "That night, when it mattered. Too late to undo the damage." "Maybe." She considered her words carefully, the way she considered every number before she committed it to a final report. Or maybe exactly in time to stop more of it. "I've spent a career looking at the difference between numbers that lied and numbers that just told an uncomfortable truth late. Sometimes late's still better than never, Dominic." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he extended his good hand across the table. "Thank you," he said, "for making him wait that night, before he came after me." His voice roughened. "I don't know that I'd have done the same for him if our places were reversed." "You did do the same for him," Zariah said, shaking his hand. You stepped in front of a bullet for a brother who just decided you might be a traitor. I think that says everything anybody needs to know. It was almost 3 weeks after the night at the estate that Lucian found her in the East Wing study, the same room she'd worked in that first chaotic day. Now quiet and ordinary in the late afternoon light. No gunfire, no terror, just the soft hum of monitors and the particular piece of a problem finally, fully solved. The Cicero property's cleared today, he said, leaning in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking more rested than she'd seen him since that morning at Halstead and Cray. Though something in his eyes had changed permanently, some weight settled into them that hadn't been there before. The particular weight of a man who'd nearly lost everyone he loved in a single night, and would never again take any of it for granted. Legitimate ownership transfers finished? No more shell companies, no more laundering routes, nothing left running through there that wouldn't survive a federal audit with a smile. Good, Zariah said, looking up from the monitor. That's good, Lucien. He crossed the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from her. The same chair Renata had sat in that first day, studying her with an expression she'd come to recognize over the last 3 weeks. Careful, considering, the look of a man who'd learned, the hard way, that the smartest thing he could do around her was think before he spoke. I have a proposition, he said. I want you to lead something new. A legitimate financial intelligence division, completely separate from anything you saw in this house 3 weeks ago, protecting my actual businesses, the restaurants, the property holdings, the construction firm, all of it, from exactly the kind of corruption that nearly destroyed everything I've built. Full authority, full resources. Nobody looking over your shoulder, nobody making jokes about anything, nobody dismissing a single word you say in a meeting. He paused, something almost vulnerable crossing his composed face. I know what you survived to get here. I know I'm part of what you survived. I'm not going to pretend this is a simple offer, or that it doesn't come with complications neither of us has fully worked out yet. But I've never in 19 years of running this family met anyone I trust the way I trust you, and I don't intend to let that walk out the door because I was too proud or too slow to ask. Zariah sat back in her chair, studying him for a long moment, turning the offer over in her mind the way she turned over every number before she trusted it. She thought about 8 years at a desk nobody respected, doing work nobody noticed, swallowing jokes about her body because the alternative was being labeled difficult, being labeled too much, being labeled anything other than quiet and small and grateful for a paycheck. She thought about 3 cents that shouldn't have existed, about the cold certainty in her chest the moment she understood what she'd found, about the 4 a.m. realization that she'd become a witness with a shelf life, and decided in that moment that she would rather be dangerous than disappeared. She thought about Devin and Priya, who never got the chance to choose anything at all, about Theo, recovering slowly, who told her he was glad she hadn't tried to be a hero, only to save her life trying to be exactly that, about Dominic's quiet shame and Lucien's broken voice in that hallway, ready to believe the worst of the person he loved most, because the alternative, trusting blindly in a world built on betrayal, had nearly gotten him killed before he learned better. She thought about this version of herself who'd sat alone in a forgotten corner office 2 months ago, believing the only space in the world where she mattered was the silent hours after everyone else went home. I'll do it, she said finally. But not because you offered me authority, Lucien. I've had authority before, technically, on paper, and it never once stopped anybody from talking over me in a meeting. I'll do it because for one night, in the worst circumstances of my entire life, I was the only person in the room whose judgment actually mattered. And I'm not interested in going back to a life where that stops being true. Something in his face eased into something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, almost entirely unguarded. Then welcome, he said, to the only job in this city where nobody's ever going to underestimate you again. I'll make sure of it personally. Months later, Zariah stood on the rooftop of a building she now had a key to, looking out over the Chicago skyline at dusk. The lake beyond it catching the last orange light of the day, and throwing it back gold across the water, the same lake she'd stared at from a blood-soaked terrace 3 weeks after the worst night of her life. She thought, standing there, about all the small humiliations that had shaped the woman she used to be, the jokes she'd swallowed, the rooms she'd shrunk herself to fit into, the years she'd spent believing her only value lay in being quiet enough not to be noticed at all. She thought about how close she'd come to losing everything for refusing to let 3 cents go unsolved, and how somehow, impossibly, that refusal had become the very thing that finally taught the world to see her clearly. She wasn't the same woman who'd sat alone in that corner office 2 months ago. She didn't think she ever would be again. And standing here now, watching the city she'd nearly died defending settle slowly into evening, she found she didn't want to be. The greatest victory, she understood now, hadn't been freezing 12 accounts in a pantry while a killer stood over her with a raised gun. It hadn't been dismantling an empire built on stolen money and quiet betrayal, or watching 3 corrupt executives walk out of a courthouse in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions nobody would ever fully answer. The greatest victory had been smaller than that, and far more permanent. It had been the simple, hard-won understanding that her mind, the one thing her mother had promised her decades ago that nobody could ever take away, had never needed anyone else's permission to be powerful. It had only ever needed a room willing to listen. She had that room now. She intended to keep it. Below her, the city kept moving the way cities always did, indifferent and enormous, and utterly unaware of the war that had nearly torn through one quiet corner of it weeks before. And Zariah Coleman, once the woman nobody saw, now the one person in the city powerful men feared crossing, watched the lights come on one by one across the skyline and allowed herself, finally, fully, to breathe.